our in-person meeting from October 21st on ESSA accountability, specifically on school quality and student success and graduation rates. We'll pause throughout the presentation to ask for questions, but if you have any questions as the webinar proceeds, please feel free to type them in the chat box and we'll be sure to address them. So to begin, we decided for this meeting that for the content of school quality and student success, we would be focusing a little bit more on attendance. And the reason that we decided to focus on attendance is because of the fact that we heard in our measures survey that this was a point of popularity, but also an area where there was interest in different possible related measures. As we think about any school quality and student success measures, we want to keep in mind these requirements that have been spelled out by the Department of Ed. They are things that obviously are required, but they're also aligned with our guiding principles. So this idea that we want to ensure that measures are differentiated by school, allow for disaggregation by specific groups of students, could be actionable by our districts and schools, and have a low burden to collect and report. So while today's presentation will focus primarily on attendance-related measures, it's important to note that we are considering a variety of potential measures for this domain. And if you haven't already taken a look at the draft framework that was presented on September 28th, I suggest that you take a look at that on our website, osse.dc.gov/ESSA. In that draft framework, you'll see that among the measures being considered are advanced placement, international baccalaureate, SAT, ACT, and re-enrollment. And certainly other measures have not been completely taken off the table, but again, we wanted to focus today's conversation on some of the additional initial analysis, that we've done on attendance-related measures. So in that vein, as we think about attendance, our real focus is on quality instructional time. And we thought it was important to sort of take a look here at how correlated we see that days in school is with PARCC performance. So in looking at this graph, which shows the percentage of students scoring at the levels 4 and 5 in English language arts, so that college and career ready level or on track for college and career readiness level, that after about 10% of days being absent, there's a really significant drop off that we're seeing in percent score on PARCC. And we see the same type of representation if we look at math performance. So again, this drives us towards a real focus on looking at quality instructional time and how we think about incentivizing schools to support students to have as much quality instructional time as possible. So we want to walk through some of the options that we have in thinking about attendance-related measures. So some of you may be familiar with what is referred to as in-seat attendance. And this is a measure that is common in DC currently. It is used in the PCSB's performance management framework to tier public charter schools. It's also used in the common reporting that happens across the district known as the equity reports. And the methodology that's used currently to calculate in-seat attendance looks at the percentage of enrolled students who were present or in seat during a given period of time. And you can see here the way that that calculation is typically done. And generally, in thinking about what would be a marker for good, quote unquote, in-seat attendance, we would generally think of that as at least 93% or above based on national averages. And so, again, the sector level goals that we currently see tend to be around that 93% range, generally between 90 and 95%. Another way to consider attendance is to look at the percentage of days each student misses or attends. And this is often defined as chronic absenteeism because it's students who are chronically absent miss 10% or more of the school year, which equates to about 18 days of instructional time being lost. And we can think about representing this sort of metric either in a positively oriented manner or a negatively oriented manner, meaning something that you want to go up or something that you want to go down. So you could think about it as wanting students to miss fewer than 10% of days or attend more than 90% of days. And so the thinking behind why we might want to use the second measure that I just described is that there's significant evidence that chronic absence predicts educational outcomes. And we see that this sort of measure considers individual kids and is highly differentiated, which we'll see a little bit further in some of the graphs we're about to walk through. We also see, which is important as we think about a framework that will serve multiple grade spans, that in the early grades, chronic absenteeism is associated with lower likelihood of grade level reading by third grade, and that similarly, it's associated with performance in upper grades in terms of high school graduation. So let's just walk through a scenario here. So if we think about a school that has 1,000 students, and we base this on each student being enrolled for 180 days. Again, we're just talking about this for example purpose. We know that in real life, every student may not be enrolled for the same number of days. But if we assume that of those 1,000 students, half of them are attended for all 180 of those days, a quarter of them attended for 171 out of the 180 days, and a quarter of them attended for 161 out of those 180 days. You'll see that we actually would end up with very different final calculations for attendance depending on the measure that we choose. So in this scenario, we would find an ISA, or an in-seat attendance measure, of 96%. So definitely above what we had defined as good ISA. But the percentage that we see for the chronic absentee measures that we discussed would be 75 or 25%, depending again on if we're looking at a positively or negatively oriented measure. An alternative is that we could also look at the average percentage of instructional days attended. So that's still a measure focused on looking at each individual student's rate of attendance and obtaining of instructional time, and that puts us at 62.5%. So you can see that how a school would fall would be different depending on the exact measure that we would use. So we wouldn't end up getting the same results from ISA and from chronic absenteeism. So just to make the difference between these measures a little bit more clear, I wanted to show some histograms of sort of what we see with DC specific data. So you can see on the left the distribution that we would see for in-seat attendance with our DC data, and on the right what we're seeing with chronic absenteeism. And so, you know, in short, the spread is quite different for chronic absenteeism. And this is significant as we think about the differentiation point that we made at the beginning of the presentation that's both aligned with our principles of wanting to be able to better understand schools that are doing really well and schools that may need support, as well as in line with the principles set forth by the Department of Education for measures in this domain. And just another way of representing the distribution here is that you can see that there's quite a bit of variation among schools with similar in-seat attendance rates when it comes to then looking at those schools by chronic absenteeism. And so, you know, we really want to continue to focus on attendance at the student level because this allows us to really see where we might be able to devote resources and support to see changes in student performance. In raising this during the conversation last week, I wanted to share some of the feedback that we heard about these measures. So one of the key points that was raised is that currently in DC, ISA is used. And there was a question raised as to whether or not there is truly a need to have some different type of measure, given that that's already an established common measure. An additional point that was raised was whether or not ISA in its form would actually be accepted under the draft regulations, given the differentiation point that we've been talking about. So just to share some other information on what we see in attendance measures in DC, just if you haven't already taken a look at the September Truancy Task Force materials, which are accessible through the Deputy Mayor for Education's website, you may want to look at those in more depth. But this just gives us a sense of what we're seeing in terms of citywide rates and in terms of rates by particular sector. It's also important to note the last bullet that almost 10% of students were profoundly or severely chronically absent, meaning that they missed 20% or more of school days in which they were enrolled. So certainly a concern given some of the graphs that we saw earlier in the presentation. And again, just another way to look at the distribution point that we've been talking about for a range of ISA from 96 to 100%, you'll see that there's a range of 9% for chronic absence, and that the average is 4, and that as you go lower, there's an even larger spread that we might see from ISA range as compared to chronic absence. So in summary, we see that both ISA and chronic absence are associated with improved PARCC outcomes, and that the percentage point increase in ISA is associated with a slightly smaller impact than what we see in terms of chronic absence. During the in-person presentation, we also spent some time on discussion about these measures, and we discussed what attendance tells us about a school and how we might think about the thresholds for a percentage of students that would need to meet a certain percentage of instructional days present, and how we think about attributing students to schools. I wanted to share a little bit about the points that were raised in response to those questions. So to the point of when a student should count, we heard, sort of the importance of setting a minimum threshold. For example, that a student would need to be present for 50% of the school year to count. We also heard that setting such a minimum threshold may not be necessary because of the denominator that might be used that would account for the number of days that the student was enrolled. And so that given that that denominator could change for each student, having a minimum threshold mattered less. And as a result, the group present in the in-person conversation sort of agreed that it would be both possible and necessary for a student's attendance rate to potentially count for multiple schools if they transferred during the school year. A point was also raised about the differences between attendance, graduation, and PARCC scores, and the importance of considering how these rates maybe look different at different grade bands. And in particular, for high school, that attendance rates may look very different than in elementary school, and that as we think about attributing points to some sort of measure about obtaining quality instructional time, that we may need to think about different targets for different grade bands. Another approach that was shared was including a growth measure for attendance to give schools recognition for positive improvement over time. Related to this point of looking over time was the idea of thinking about a measure that would consider a rolling average, because this might stabilize a measure, However, a counterpoint was raised to this that if a school was improving rapidly on a measure of quality instructional time, that it may take longer for the accountability system to recognize that growth. Before we move on to graduation rate, are there any questions about the conversation that we just shared on attendance and measures related to instructional time? Okay, with that, we're going to move on to graduation rate. So just as a refresher, and if you haven't taken a look at some of the resources on the ESSA webpage, you may be interested in a document called Required Measures that walks through all of the requirements for each domain. But just to recap, the 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate per the federal statute and draft regulations is required in 2 ways in our accountability system. The first is that it's required as an indicator in the graduation domain that counts towards determining our lowest 5% of Title I schools. The second is that any school with lower than a 67% 4-year cohort rate has to be identified for comprehensive support. We do have 2 areas for flexibility in the way that this measure is applied, however. The first is that in addition to the 4-year cohort rate being included as an indicator in our framework for accountability, we also have the opportunity to include extended cohorts, such as 5- or 6-year, or other measures related to graduation rate. The second is that we can think about support in different ways for schools that are identified in the comprehensive support category based on either being identified solely because of that 67% trigger versus those that are identified based on falling in the lowest 5% of the framework overall. So the intervention that we choose to implement for schools identified from the trigger only could be different than the treatment for those schools identified in comprehensive support because of being in the lowest 5% overall. And as we think about the impact of that 4-year 67% trigger that's been set out through the federal regulations and statute, it's important to note that we have seen a decrease in the schools that would be identified over time. So you can see in our most current year's data, 13 high schools would have been under this threshold, and that's a decrease from what we've seen in prior years. So part of our conversation last week was talking about the impact of subgroups on thinking about graduation rate, because as you may be aware, as part of thinking about our accountability system development, we have to consider how we will factor in subgroups of specific groups of students. And so in looking at this table here, you'll see that if we looked at an N size of 10, 15, 20, or 25, that many of our schools would not actually have a sufficient number of students in each of these N sizes to count. And so we talked as a group about how this may impact our approach to weighing in subgroups for this particular measure, and that we would really want to think about not only N size, but stability of these N sizes over time. Because as we know already, there are definite changes in the number of kids that are in specific graduation cohorts for schools from year to year. Another point that was raised as part of the conversation on graduation rate was the applicability of a high school framework to alternative schools, particularly because we know that many of our alternative schools, their mission is not to graduate students in 4 years, but to graduate students in 5 or more years. And based on the information that we currently have from the proposed regulations and federal statute, It is our understanding that alternative schools must be included in our accountability framework, and that we cannot have a separate, unique framework that just applies to alternative schools. However, the definition of alternative schools is not as explicitly clear, and so exactly what schools would fall into that category is something that OSSE is working to further identify and get clarity on. It's important to note that while alternative schools do have to be included in the framework that's implemented next school year, so in the 17-18 school year, adult high schools do not. And we are certainly considering including adult high schools in the future, or adult schools in general, I should say. However, it's not something we are planning to do in the first year of implementation. So we understand that it is critically important for us to be clear with schools and LEAs which schools would be counted as alternative and have to be included in the first year versus those that would not be included until future years when adult may be added to our accountability system. However, with alternative schools needing to be included, that point we were discussing about the opportunity for flexibility on treatment of interventions based on how a school is identified for comprehensive support is critically important. So if an alternative school was solely identified for falling under that 67% rate, we might treat them differently than a school that was identified based on falling in the bottom 5% of the framework overall. Any further questions about graduation rate? During our in-person meeting, we also had some conversations further on N size and about the pros and cons of dealing with different strategies for low N size, whether or not we might remove points from the overall denominator if groups are not of sufficient size, whether or not we might assign fixed number of points for subgroups and distribute points evenly, whether or not we would distribute points based on subgroup size, or whether or not we would calculate different frameworks for each subgroup. And ultimately, we determined that the most important next step there is really modeling some different options based on both N size and subgroup size and coming back for further discussion. We also talked about the inclusion of 5 or 6 year extended cohort rates and heard quite a bit of interest, definitely in including 5-year, which is consistent with what we've heard in previous conversations and in the measure survey, and interest in learning more about what the potential impact of including 6-year would be. We talked about why including these metrics could be helpful because it could motivate schools to focus on graduating students even after they hit the 4-year mark, and give schools credit for graduating students even if it happens after that 4-year mark. We talked also about the opportunity for flexibility around weighting. So while the federal government requires that 4-year cohort rate be weighted more than any other measures in graduation rate, individually, in the aggregate, additional measures could be weighted more. So we could have 4-year weighted at 7 points, for example, 5-year weighted at 6 points, and 6-year weighted at 5 points. And in the aggregate, 5 and 6-year would be more than 4-year, but so long as they are less individually than 4-year, it is still allowable. So again, this is an area where playing out our data and seeing how different weights and inclusion of different measures might impact how schools are distributed is something that we plan to do additional modeling on. Does appear that we have any additional questions. As a reminder, there is another in-person engagement happening this morning beginning at 10:30 at OSSE, where we will be recapping this and the other focus group sessions that have taken place over the last month. There will also be a recap of that webinar this Friday, and you can find the details for registration on that webinar and other upcoming engagement opportunities on our website, osse.dc.gov/ESSA, just clicking on the hyperlink for engagement opportunities. The recording of today's webinar, as well as the materials from this focus group, as well as other focus groups related to accountability system development and our ESSA state plan development, are also available on that webpage. If at any time you have additional questions on the accountability system development or the development of our state plan, feel free to email us at osse.essa, ESSA@dc.gov. Thank you so much for your participation, and have a great morning.